Hi everyone, and welcome back to the Cora's Quilts YouTube channel, where it's my mission to help you make stunning quilts simply. I am so excited that you're here, and I know that everyone is so excited to start working on our Barn Star Sampler project. And so the purpose of today's video is to share with you the steps I like to take to prepare my workspace and prepare my fabric before I start any big quilting project. My name is Shelley Cavanna. I write quilt patterns and design fabric, and I write quilting books like the Barn Star Sampler. You can find my books and my fabric and my patterns at your favorite local quilt shop, or you can find them online at our website at corasquilts.com. You can also find us under most major social media platforms using the handle at Cora's Quilts. I know for many of you, this is your first quilt along with me, and so the purpose of today's video is really to share with you the steps I like to take to prepare my workspace and prepare my fabric before I start any big quilt project. Today's video is going to cover the steps I take to make my workspace work for me, my list of must-have and nice-to-have tools, and finally how I prep my fabric for maximum accuracy. And while I'm making this video specifically as part of our Barn Star Sampler quilt along, these steps and these practices are really a good thing to get into the habit of doing at the beginning of any big quilting project. If you're a fan of cooking shows like me, or if you're a whiz in the kitchen, then mise en place is probably a phrase you know well. It's a French term that literally means put in place. Most simply, it's the practice of cleaning, preparing, and organizing our workspace, our tools, and our quote-unquote ingredients ahead of time, so that when it's time to get down to business, we can get straight to work and we have everything that we need prepped and already at hand. So here are the 5 steps I take before I start any quilting project. Step 1 is to clean your workspace. Even if you don't have a dedicated sewing space, take the time to return all your tools and notions to their home, clear your cutting surface, and organize and put away any projects that you're not immediately working on. This is always the hardest step for me because I just want to start sewing, but I'm always happiest sewing in a clean, organized studio. Plus, spending an hour or two organizing saves me the hassle of constantly looking for scissors or rulers amongst piles of chaos. Step 2 is to perform some basic machine maintenance. You should be starting every project with a brand new needle. Clean out lint and stray threads from your sewing machine and add oil per your machine manufacturer's specifications. Find and attach your 1/4 inch or quilting foot and use one with an open toe if that's an option for you. These are all incredibly important steps to set yourself up for success, but the most important step, and the one that we're all guilty of skipping, is checking your machine's 1/4 inch seam allowance. We're simply looking to verify that what we think we're stitching at the 1/4 inch seam is actually a true 1/4 inch seam. Because believe it or not, all 1/4 inch feet aren't always actually a 1/4 inch. So take the time to make a test block and make any adjustments that you need to your needle position or your machine. If you're not sure how to do this, then we've left the link to one of our blog posts with a few suggestions down in the description box below. If you have some extra time, you may also think about pre-winding some extra bobbins just so that you don't have to ruin your quilting groove when your bobbins run out mid-block. Step 3 is to gather your tools. You should read through your entire pattern before you start sewing. And not only does this help you know where you're going, but it will also help you make a list of the supplies that you'll need so that you're able to gather your tools before you start sewing. We're going to break up our supplies into 2 categories, must-have tools and nice-to-have tools. We're also going to rank those nice to have tools in my personal order of importance to help you plan as your quilting budget allows you to acquire new goodies. I am definitely a minimalist when it comes to quilting tools and notions. I write my books and my patterns so that they don't require specialty rulers, or if we have a special shape to make, that they include templates, and I don't have any projects that require any sort of foundation or paper piecing at all. If you already have a few quilts under your belt, then most likely you have most, if not all, of these must-have tools already in your sewing space. So the first must-have tools are rotary rulers, a rotary cutter, and a rotary mat. My must-have rulers are a 6-inch by 24-inch ruler for cutting strips from yardage. And I also like to have a 6-inch by 12-inch or a 10-inch square ruler for cutting larger pieces. A 6.5-inch or similarly sized smaller square ruler for cutting smaller pieces is also really handy to have as well. Just make sure that you have one with your diagonal lines marked too. And make sure that you're working with a rotary cutter with a super sharp blade. We don't want to have any cutting accidents in our sewing space. You're also going to need an iron and some sort of an ironing board or a pressing mat. You'll need a sewing machine with extra needles and your favorite thread. I prefer to piece all of my quilts using Wonderfil's Deco Bob 80 weight cottonized polyester thread. This is a treated thread so that it behaves like a cotton thread, but it's only half as thick as your 50 weight cotton thread. Skinnier thread means skinnier seams, which is a huge bonus when you're making complex quilts like our Barnstar sampler. And because the thread is polyester, this means there's virtually no lint at all. You're also going to need a couple of pairs of scissors. I prefer to keep a nice pair of fabric shears, a big large pair, and then also a much smaller pair of really tiny thread snipping scissors. You should also have a seam ripper on hand just in case. You're going to need some good, extra sharp, extra fine pins. We're going to be practicing our precision piecing skills, so you're looking for extra fine, really skinny, super sharp pins. My favorite are these extra fine pins from Clover, especially because they have glass heads, which means you're not in danger of melting your plastic pin head if you accidentally run the iron over it. And finally, you're going to need a water-soluble marker or some sort of a temporary fabric marking tool. A good option is one of those blue water-soluble pens from Clover, but the best option in my opinion is one of these 3-in-1 ceramic pencils from Sewline. You have light and dark chalk for marking dark and light fabrics all in one pencil. The lines are dark enough to see, but not in any danger of bleeding through to the front of your quilt. I do not recommend that you use any sort of heat-soluble marker at all. So those are our must-have tools, and now it's time to take a look at our nice-to-have tools. So if you only have room for one of these specialty tools in your budget, then my number one choice would be a wool pressing mat. And this is a really incredibly useful item because the mat actually absorbs the heat from your iron as you press your blocks. So essentially, you're pressing from the front and the back of the block at the same time. The result is a super crisp, incredibly flat block. It's also really nice to have a tailor's clapper or some sort of heavy object on hand that is safe to leave on top of your blocks as they cool. And the purpose of this is to just make sure that your blocks stay nice and flat as they cool. One really inexpensive tool that is really nice to have on hand is a tailor's awl or a stiletto. And this is really useful for helping guide your fabric through your sewing machine. Many of my patterns, including the Barnstar sampler, use stitch and flip piecing techniques very, very frequently. So if you are not a fan of marking your stitching lines before you start sewing, you're going to want to have some sort of a sewing machine guide like the Sew Straight guide, or some diagonal seam washi tape, or other painter's tape, any kind of temporary tape on hand. Another inexpensive and easy to find tool to have on hand is a washable glue stick like the Soline water-soluble glue pen. Glue basting is a really handy technique for some of our smaller stitch and flip units, and having that small washable stick will speed up your piecing. A small washable glue stick works as well here too. The key is to find something washable. I prefer to do all of my pressing with a dry iron. I personally don't use steam anytime at all, but sometimes we do have blocks that just don't want to lay flat, and we need to add a little bit of moisture as we're pressing to help kind of smooth things out. So my product of choice is Flatter. It is a non-starch based smoothing spray, and it will help tame those stubborn blocks without the fear of flakes or shrinking your fabric. Step 4 is to prepare your fabric. If you've sewn along with me before, then you probably already know that I am a huge advocate of starching your fabric. Starch adds a ton of stability, and it makes your fabric less likely to stretch or distort as you're sewing. And quite honestly, I think it just makes your fabric so much easier to piece. I find that my blocks are so much more accurate when I use starched fabric. During one of our previous quilt-alongs, we did a deep dive into some of the different kinds of starch available on the market and to the different degrees that they affect your fabric. I'm leaving the link to that video in the description box below, but here are my thoughts in a nutshell. Before I share my thoughts though, I do want to say that pre-washing and starching your fabric is a super controversial topic among quilters. The most important thing I will say though is that you should do whatever works best for you. There are no right or wrong answers here. I'm just telling you what works for me. And if you don't know what works best for you, then experiment with some practice fabric and find out what you like. So in all honesty, I rarely pre-wash my fabric. But whatever you're going to do as far as pre-washing goes, either do it for all of your fabrics or do it for none. I do, however, always wash my quilts with a color catcher just to make sure I don't have any issues with the colors bleeding. And if you're working with pre-cut squares or strips or fat quarters or fat eighths, it's not a good idea to pre-wash those. They will shrink and distort to unusable sizes and shapes. Like I said before, I am a huge advocate for starching your fabrics. My starch of choice is the Faultless Luxe Laundry Starch. It comes in the aerosol can. And again, with this product, as with pre-washing your fabric, you either do it for all of your fabrics or you do it for none. And the most important thing is that you must do it before you cut any of your pieces. You cannot go back and starch your pieces after you've cut them because they will shrink and you'll have a massive headache on your hands. Starch your fabric from the wrong side of the fabric and let it dry completely before you start pressing. And regardless of whether or not you starch, take the time to press your fabric really well. You will thank yourself later as you're cutting. Finally, step 5 is to cut and organize your fabric. You want to carefully cut your fabric according to the instructions in your pattern, and you want to make sure that as you're cutting, you are measuring using the marks on your ruler rather than the marks on your cutting mat. Also going to want to label the pieces as directed in the pattern as you cut them. While we're putting our blocks together, the assembly diagrams in the pattern or in the books will identify each piece by the letter following the dimension in the cutting instructions. I am excited to share that our reusable vinyl sticker labels will be back in the shop in just a few weeks, but we also have free downloadable labels on our website that you can print at home on standard mailing address labels. And one final suggestion, if you are working from a book, I really suggest that you take the book to your local printing shop or your office supply store and ask them to put a spiral binding on your book. This is a really inexpensive thing to do, and it is such a great thing to be able to have your book laying open flat as you're cutting without it closing or the pages flopping back and forth. So those are the steps that I like to take before making any quilt. But these are just the things that work for my own creative process. Remember that there are no right or wrong answers here. So if there are other things that you like to do to prepare yourself or your space for making a new quilt project, tell us about it in the comments below. Hopefully today's video has given you a few ideas for how you can start preparing for our Barn Star Sampler Quilt Along program, which is beginning next Friday, March 17th. I am so excited to start sewing with you guys, and I'll see you next week. Thank you so much for watching today's video. Remember that you can share your Quilt Along progress photos over on Instagram using hashtag BarnstarSampler. And be sure to tag us at Cora's Quilts so that we can see your photos too. And don't forget to grab your free Barn Star Sampler Quilt Along block checklist. We've left a link to download it in the description box below. If you've enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up and make sure you're subscribed to our YouTube channel. Happy sewing, and we'll see you soon with another Barn Star Sampler tutorial.